Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Brad Musil, and this is a reading of The Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. This will be section B of part 2 of chapter 3, William James and the Varieties of Religious Experience. Again, this is section B, James's characterization and categorization of religious experience. Having offered his general definition of religion early on in Varieties and established that he seeks to concern himself only with individual religion, James continues to flesh out what he means by religious experience throughout the remainder of the lectures. In doing so, he expounds on two chief characteristics of religious experience. One, belief in the reality of the unseen, i.e., the God-like, and two, a significant adjustment to that reality. Accordingly, when describing, quote, religion in the broadest and most general terms possible, end quote, James says it amounts to, quote, belief that there is an unseen order and that our supreme good lies in harmoniously adjusting ourselves thereto. This belief and this adjustment are the religious attitude in the soul, end quote. Footnote 512 cites the source. He elaborates on each of these hallmarks of religion, beginning with, quote, the belief in an object which we cannot see, end quote. Footnote 513 cites the source. When it comes to religion's essential belief in the reality of the unseen, James starts by observing that such belief comes in many forms and by way of many objects of belief. On this point, he is quick to mention that these objects of belief result from abstract ideas, not from any kind of physical experience or sensation. These objects of belief vary in terms of their abstractness, according to James, but the entire spectrum of religious objects of belief, including those that are more concrete, stem from the realm of ideas, not from physical sensation or observation. Hence, as James observes, even in, quote, the more concrete objects of most men's religion, the deities whom they worship are known to them only in idea, end quote. Footnote 514 cites the source. Additionally, James claims that, quote, the absence of definite sensible images is positively insisted on by the mystical authorities in all religions, end quote. Footnote 515 cites the source. What's more, despite having not originated in the corporeal realm of our everyday experience, these objects of religious worship still inspire significant changes within it. And even in the case of more abstract objects of worship, such as God's holiness and God's justice, the effect of such belief on the physical world can be just as potent. In this respect, quote, religion is full of abstract objects which prove to have an equal power, end quote. Footnote 516 cites the source. In his explication of this point, James offers an extended discussion of Immanuel Kant, whom he thinks shares his perspective regarding the ability of objects of belief arising from, quote, pure ideas, end quote, to inspire practical effects in the physical world. He concludes this discussion by observing, quote, theoretically speaking, they, i.e., words and phrases like God, the design of creation, and the soul, are words devoid of any significance. Yet, strangely enough, they have a definite meaning for our practice. We can act as if there were a God, feel as if we were free, consider nature as if she were full of special designs, lay plans as if we were immortal. And we find that these words do make a genuine difference in our moral life. So we have the strange phenomenon, as Kant assures us, of a mind believing with all its strength in the real presence of a set of things of no one of which it can form any notion whatsoever. End quote. Footnote 517 cites the source. We see then that religious belief in the reality of the unseen is thought to elicit significant changes in both the physical and psychological realms of experience. To be sure, while they may arise from pure ideas, such religious objects of belief are nevertheless an essential part of reality for those who believe in them. Hence, quote, beings they are, end quote, James observes, quote, beings as real in the realm which they inhabit as the changing things of sense are in the realm of space, end quote. Footnote 518 cites the source. Footnote 519. At this point in his analysis, James references Plato, whom he suggests, quote, gave so brilliant and impressive a defense of this common human feeling that the doctrine of the reality of abstract objects has been known as the Platonic theory of ideas ever since, end quote. And I cite the source there. So that's the end of footnote 519. In fact, James claims, quote, they are as convincing to those who have them as any direct sensible experiences can be, and they are, as a rule, much more convincing than results established by mere logic ever are, end quote. Footnote 520 cites the source. Interestingly, James suggests that belief in the reality of the unseen is usually not a byproduct of any kind of intellectual analysis, but rather tends to stem from something more akin to sensation or feeling. On this point, he claims, quote, we may now lay it down as certain that in the distinctively religious sphere of experience, many persons, how many we cannot tell, possess the objects of their belief not in the form of mere conceptions which their intellect accepts as true, but rather in the form of quasi-sensible realities directly apprehended. The feeling of reality may be something more like a sensation than an intellectual operation properly so called. End quote. Footnote 521 cites the source. Hence, the source for religious belief in the reality of the unseen is not something we hear, smell, taste, touch, or see, yet James suggests it is more akin to these kinds of sensations than it is to any kind of analytical thought process. According to James, quote, "It is as if there were in the human consciousness a sense of reality, a feeling of objective presence, a perception of what we may call something there, more deep and more general than any of the special and particular senses by which the current psychology supposes existent realities to be originally revealed." End quote. Footnote 522 cites the source. James goes so far as to say that this sense of the unseen is sometimes felt to be even stronger than ordinary sensation. Footnote 523 cites the source. And he concludes that in this regard, quote, "we are dealing with a well-marked natural kind of fact," end quote. Footnote 524 cites the source. James juxtaposes mysticism with rationalism during his examination of the relationship between the feelings and intellectual processes, or lack thereof, underlying religious belief in the reality of the unseen. On James's account, mysticism reveals a more private kind of truth and is rooted in inarticulate feelings and sensations, while rationalism advocates a version of truth that can be fully articulated and verified via intellectual analysis. He puts the point as follows, quote, "The opinion opposed to mysticism in philosophy is sometimes spoken of as rationalism. Rationalism insists that all our beliefs ought ultimately to find for themselves articulate grounds." End quote. Footnote 525 cites the source. He then defends the merits of mysticism from the frequent intrusions of rationalism, suggesting that when it comes to many phenomena of life, and not just religious ones, feelings actually precede and rule over logic and reason. Footnote 526. This notion is supported by many passages and varieties, such as the following, quote, "So with fear, with indignation, jealousy, ambition, worship. If they are there, life changes, and whether they shall be there or not depends almost always upon non-logical, often on organic conditions. And as the excited interest with which these passions put into the world is our gift to the world, just so are the passions themselves gifts." End quote. And I cite the source there. End of footnote 526. As a result, he concludes that, quote, "If you have intuitions at all, they come from a deeper level of your nature than the loquacious level with which rationalism inhabits," end quote. And he suggests that, quote, "this inferiority of the rationalistic level in founding belief is just as manifest when rationalism argues for religion as when it argues against it," end quote. Footnote 527 cites the source. Ultimately, James believes religious belief, like many other elements of life, will only make sense to an individual if it is already rooted in a deeper seated feeling or sensation, which can be known only by the individual. Hence, he suggests, quote, "The truth that is that in the metaphysical and religious sphere, articulate reasons are cogent for us only when our inarticulate feelings of reality have already been impressed in favor of the same conclusion," end quote. Footnote 528 cites the source. For those who do have this kind of religious feeling, logic and reason usually pose little threat to the religious beliefs that arise from it. On this point, he observes, quote, "If you do have them, i.e. religious sensations, and have them at all strongly, the probability is that you cannot help regarding them as genuine perceptions of truth, as revelations of a kind of reality which no adverse argument, however unanswerable by you in words, can expel from your belief." End quote. Footnote 529 cites the source. In sum, when it comes to religious beliefs, as well as many other kinds of beliefs, quote, "instinct leads, intelligence does but follow. If a person feels the presence of a living God after the fashion shown by my quotations, your critical arguments, be they never so superior, will vainly set themselves to change his faith." End quote. Footnote 530 cites the source. In addition to belief in the reality of an unseen power, James claims religion entails a significant adjustment to this reality. In this sense, it engenders a significant existential reaction, thanks to which religion delivers existential relief to believers. As James says, quote, "Religion, whatever it is a man's total reaction upon life," end quote. Footnote 531 cites the source. James characterizes this element of the religious experience as, quote, "that curious sense of the whole residual cosmos as an everlasting presence," end quote. And he claims, quote, "this sense of the world's presence makes us react about life at large," end quote. Footnote 532 cites the source. Moreover, this existential reaction is something the religious individual takes very seriously. Hence, James claims that, quote, "for common men, religion, whatever more special meanings they may have, signifies always a serious state of mind, end quote. Footnote 533 cites the source. Further characterizing this sentiment embedded in religion, he suggests, quote, if any one phrase could gather its universal message, that phrase would be, all is not vanity in this universe, whatever the appearances may suggest, end quote. Footnote 534 cites the source. Similarly, he states, quote, the divine shall mean for us only such a primal reality as the individual feels impelled to respond to solemnly and gravely, and neither by a curse nor a jest, end quote. Footnote 535 cites the source. James's fairly well-known distinction between once-born and twice-born religious types is rooted in the essential adjustment to the higher unseen power. The division of these two types ultimately stems from their different perspectives of evil, which is to be taken here in both a moral and a natural sense, i.e., in addition to moral wrongs, it incorporates natural pain and suffering associated with earthly life. Generally speaking, if the evil aspects of life are not considered to be a major concern for the religious individual, he or she is deemed once born. The basic idea is that such an individual receives the good religion is thought to deliver immediately, without any deliberations on evil and prolonged preoccupation with pain and suffering. The once born type still undergoes a kind of existential transformation as a result of his or her religious beliefs, after which he or she sees existence in a new, reinvigorating light, but it is not necessary to venture beyond the bounds of the earthly world to solicit such relief. If, on the other hand, the religious individual suffers significantly, first, going through trials and tribulations before receiving deliverance via religion, he or she is said to be twice born. On James's account, the twice born cannot find salvation within the confines of earthly life, and so they must travel beyond it, into the supernatural realm, in order to alleviate their fixation on the ills of life. In the case of the once born type, the existential reaction central to religious experience is of a more rudimentary kind, while for the twice-born type it is of a more complex nature and involves overcoming a significant existential crisis. In turn, these two religious types are born out of two kinds of natural dispositions towards evil, the healthy-minded and the morbid-minded. Describing these two kinds of attitudes and how they influence religious development, James says, quote, the sanguine and healthy-minded live habitually on the sunny side of their misery line. The depressed and melancholy live beyond it in a darkness and apprehension. There are men who seem to have started in life with a bottle or two of champagne inscribed to their credit, whilst others seem to have been born close to the pain threshold, which the slightest irritants fatally send them over. Does it not appear as if one who lived more habitually on one side of the pain threshold might need a different sort of religion from one who habitually lived on the other? End quote. Footnote 536 cites the source. Interestingly, James maintains that the twice-born type offers a more developed or genuine kind of experience, which I will say more about shortly. First, however, I shall offer a bit more detail regarding each of these important religious types. Thanks to his or her religious belief, the once-born type recognizes the good inherent in earthly life and is happy with his or her natural conditions therein. Therefore, the pain and suffering implicit in natural existence do not constitute any considerable difficulty for the once-born type, and any concerns about evil are short-lived. In fact, this type often proactively seeks to minimize such concerns, and an aversion to evil is a central tenet of religious belief for this type. While James thinks there is something lacking in the once-born type, he does appreciate some benefits of this particular type, most notably the healthy-mindedness and optimism it is founded on. He asks, quote, what can be more base and unworthy than the pining, pulling, mumping mood, no matter by what outward ills it may have been engendered, end quote. Footnote 537 cites the source. The once-born type presents us with the opposite kind of reaction, namely one of unreserved optimism, which helps individuals overcome any evil lying in their way. Ultimately, thanks to a religious transformation, the once-born type is awakened to a greater sense of meaning born out of a natural earthly life. As a result of the once-born type's refusal to entertain depressing thoughts about evil, it is said to be rooted in a healthy-minded attitude, reflecting, quote, those who, when unhappiness is offered or proposed to them, positively refuse to feel it, as if it were something mean and wrong, end quote. Footnote 538 cites the source. Along these lines, while summarizing his account of the healthy-minded, James says, quote, we saw how this temperament may become the basis for a peculiar type of religion, a religion in which good, even the good of this world's life, is regarded as the essential thing for a rational being to attend to, end quote. Footnote 539 cites the source. James also alludes to the popularity of this kind of attitude toward evil, suggesting, quote, It is probable that there never has been a century in which the deliberate refusal to think ill of life has not been idealized by a sufficient number of persons to form sects, open or secret, who claimed all natural things to be permitted." End quote. Footnote 540 cites the source. James further develops his notion of the healthy-minded type by discussing two subtypes within it, the simple and the complex. The simple healthy-minded type acknowledges death, suffering, and evil in the world, but easily reconciles these ills with the good in life. It offers a simple, involuntary way of feeling happy about things, which James associates with some of the Greeks and Romans. Footnote 541 cites the source. The complex, healthy-minded type, on the other hand, consciously tries to refuse to acknowledge death and suffering at all. For this type, a concerted effort is made to view everything as good, thanks to which evil is not recognized at all. James characterizes this more complex type as more systemic and voluntary, and cites Walt Whitman, footnote 542. James suggests, quote, "Walt Whitman owes his importance in literature to the systemic expulsion from his writings of all contractile elements," end quote. James observes it's because Whitman held that, quote, "all things are divinely good," end quote, that, quote, "it has come about that many persons today regard Walt Whitman as the restorer of the eternal natural religion," end quote. And I cite the sources there. So that's the end of footnote 542. Baruch Spinoza, footnote 543. James says, for example, Spinoza, quote, "Spinoza's philosophy has this sort of healthy-mindedness woven into the heart of it, and this has been one secret of its fascination," end quote. He also quotes a passage from Spinoza that speaks to the advantages of reason and love and warns against fear, anxiety, and remorse. And I quote the sources. That's the end of footnote 543. The mind cure movement, footnote 544. Regarding the mind cure movement, James writes, quote, "It is a deliberately optimistic scheme of life, with both a speculative and a practical side," end quote. And he argues, quote, "It must now be reckoned with as a genuine religious power," end quote. Quote, "You see already by such records of experience how impossible it is not to class mind cure as primarily a religious movement," end quote. And I cite the sources there. That was the end of footnote 544. What nowadays, so the mind cure movement, what nowadays might be referred to as the positive thinking school of thought, and naturalism, footnote 545. James talks about, quote, "a new sort of religion of nature," quote, "thanks to which," quote, "we find evolutionism interpreted thus optimistically and embraced as a substitute for the religion they were born in by a multitude of our contemporaries who have either been trained scientifically or been fond of reading popular science, and who had already begun to be inwardly dissatisfied with what seemed to them the harshness and irrationality of the orthodox Christian scheme," end quote. And I cite the source. So that's the end of footnote 545 as prime examples of it. So I'm going to go ahead and reread that sentence. James characterizes this more complex type as more systemic and voluntary, and cites Walt Whitman, footnote 542, Baruch Spinoza, footnote 543, the mind cure movement, footnote 544, what nowadays might be referred to as the positive thinking school of thought, and naturalism, footnote 545, as prime examples of it. James describes the difference between the simple involuntary type and the more complex voluntary type in the following. Quote, "If, then, we give the name of healthy-mindedness to the tendency which looks on all things and sees that they are good, we find that we must distinguish between a more involuntary and a more voluntary or systemic way of being healthy-minded. In its involuntary variety, healthy-mindedness is a way of feeling happy about things immediately. In its systemical variety, it is an abstract way of conceiving things as good. Systemic healthy-mindedness, conceiving good as the essential and universal aspect of being, deliberately excludes evil from its field of vision." End quote. Footnote 546 cites the source. Footnote 547. James offers a similar description of this kind of attitude that reminds me of something a cognitive psychologist might say regarding evil things. Quote, "Refuse to admit their badness, despise their power, ignore their presence. Turn your attention the other way, and so far as you yourself are concerned at any rate, though the facts may still exist, their evil character exists no longer. Since you make them evil or good by your own thoughts about them, it is the ruling of your thoughts which proves to be your principal concern." End quote. I cite the source there. So that's the end of footnote 547. Interestingly, in pointing out the virtues of this cheery disposition, James makes a point very similar to the one Nietzsche made regarding pity. Footnote 548 cites the source. He suggests that dwelling on the evil in the world, which manifests itself in the form of fear and anxiety, quote, "but fastens and perpetuates the trouble which occasioned it, and increases the total evil of the situation," end quote. Footnote 549 cites the source. This is practically the mantra of the systemic healthy-minded, once-born and religious type, who, as James suggests, proposed that, quote, evil is a disease, and worry over disease is itself an additional form of disease, which only adds to the original complaint, end quote. Footnote 550 cites the source. As opposed to the once-born, the twice-born are not so easily saved from the evils of the natural world, and they must venture beyond this natural world in order to gain their salvation. Indeed, the twice-born types struggle mightily with the weight of evil, and as a result, they do not share the healthy-mindedness belonging to the once-born type. As James says, quote, in contrast with such healthy-minded views as these, if we treat them as a way of deliberately minimizing evil, stands a radically opposite view, a way of maximizing evil, if you please so to call it, based on the persuasion that the evil aspects of our life are of its very essence, and that the world's meaning must come home to us when we lay them most to heart, end quote. Footnote 551 cites the source. Again, this points to the fundamental difference between the two types. The once-born type espouses evasion of evil, while the twice-born type deems it an essential element of our experience. According to James, from the perspective of the twice-born type, to dismiss evil is to ignore an unavoidable and ever-palpable feature of existence. Contrasting the existential reaction of the twice-born type with that of the once-born type, James suggests that, in the case of the twice-born type, quote, the process is one of redemption, not of mere reversion to natural health. And the sufferer, when saved, is saved by what seemed to him a second birth, a deeper kind of conscious being than he could enjoy before, end quote. Footnote 552 cites the source. In fact, for the twice-born, quote, natural good is not simply insufficient in amount and transient, there lurks a falsity in its very being, end quote. Footnote 553 cites the source. From the perspective of the twice-born, quote, there are two lives, the natural and the spiritual, and we must lose the one before we can participate in the other, end quote. Footnote 554 cites the source. Contrary to the healthy-minded type, James suggests that those who cannot so easily dismiss the evils of the world inherit a kind of morbid-mindedness, exhibiting, as he says, a, quote, more morbid way of looking at the situation, end quote. Footnote 555 cites the source. The idea here is that for the morbid-minded, the pain and suffering inherent in life are accentuated, and as Proudfoot points out, someone who is morbid-minded and religious, quote, is constantly reminded of her sinfulness and estrangement from God, end quote. Footnote 556 cites the source. Those who are morbid-minded may be able to experience occasional bouts of positive energy and happiness, but such occasions are inevitably short-lived, for the reality of doom and despair still lurks behind everything for them. In commenting on examples he has given of morbid-mindedness, one of which is based on his own personal experience, James suggests, quote, one of them gives us the vanity of mortal things, another the sense of sin, and the remaining one describes the fear of the universe. And in one or the other of these three ways, it always is that man's original optimism and self-satisfaction get leveled with the dust, end quote. Footnote 557 cites the source. As he did with the healthy-minded type, James discusses subtypes of the morbid-minded type, observing that, quote, just as we saw that in healthy-mindedness there are shallower and profounder levels, so also there are different levels of the morbid mind, and the one is much more formidable than the other, end quote. Footnote 558 cites the source. Accordingly, he details two basic kinds of morbid-mindedness, mild and extreme. He associates an endymion with the mild subtype, which he defines as, quote, mere passive joylessness and dreariness, discouragement, dejection, lack of taste and zest and spring, end quote. Footnote 559 cites the source. He describes the mild morbid-minded type as having a general, quote, sense of incapacity for joyous feeling, end quote. Footnote 560 cites the source. Quote, a much worse form of the morbid-minded type, end quote, James claims, quote, is positive and active anguish, a sort of cyclical neuralgia, wholly unknown to healthy life, end quote. Footnote 561 cites the source, which can offer, quote, a pitch of unhappiness so great that the goods of nature may be entirely forgotten, end quote. Footnote 562 cites the source. This extreme morbid-minded type exhibits a sense of loathing, and, quote, for this extremity of pessimism to be reached, something more is needed than observation of life and reflection upon death. The individual must, in his own person, become the prey of a pathological melancholy, end quote. Footnote 563 cites the source. James makes it quite clear that cases of melancholy on the very extreme end of the spectrum, without any sense of hope whatsoever, do not constitute religion. In fact, he says, quote, melancholy, according to our ordinary use of language, forfeits all title to be called religious, end quote, and he suggests that, quote, religion is equally hostile to heavy grumbling and complaint, end quote. Footnote 564 cites the source. Ultimately, two possibilities emerge for those destined to this kind of extreme morbid-mindedness: prolonged melancholy or religious salvation. James cites Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche as examples of individuals who exude this kind of extreme melancholy, deeming them too pessimistic and downtrodden to legitimately represent religious types. According to James, people like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, quote, lack the purgatorial note which religious sadness gives forth, end quote. Footnote 565 cites the source. Thus, James argues the cantankerous temper associated with some extremer versions of the morbid-minded type is not of the religious type, and these counterfeit forms must be duly distinguished from more genuine forms of religion. Reflecting on an example cited, James says, quote, you see how the querulous temper of his misery keeps his mind from taking a religious direction. Querulousness of mind tends in fact rather towards irreligion, and it has played, so far as I know, no part whatever in the construction of religious systems. Religious melancholy must be cast in a more melting mood, end quote. Footnote 566 cites the source. Alternatively, James cites Leo Tolstoy as a legitimate example of the twice-born religious type. Tolstoy endures an existential crisis and qualifies, on James's account, as morbid-minded. Quote, in Tolstoy's case, he observes, the sense that life had any meaning whatever was for a time wholly withdrawn. The result was a transformation in the whole expression of reality, end quote. Footnote 567 cites the source. However, all is not lost for Tolstoy, and he is not destined to prolonged bouts of extreme melancholy, thanks to a religious transformation. According to James, this is typical of the twice-born type. As a result of an existential crisis, quote, an urgent wondering and questioning is set up, a pouring theoretic activity, and in the desperate effort to get into right relations with the matter, the sufferer is often led to what becomes for him a satisfying religious solution, end quote. Footnote 568 cites the source. In sum, through their discovery of the higher, unseen power and their subsequent adjustment thereto, the twice-born are able to overcome what might have otherwise become a crippling and debilitating awareness of the evils inherent in life. Clearly, there are significant differences between James's once-born and twice-born religious types. Not surprisingly, James describes a fundamental tension between the two mentalities that results from their incongruent views of evil. Accordingly, he observes, quote, we can see how great an antagonism may naturally arise between the healthy-minded way of viewing life and the way that takes all this experience of evil as something essential. To this latter way, the morbid-minded way, as we might call it, healthy-mindedness, pure and simple, seems unspeakably blind and shallow. To the healthy-minded way, on the other hand, the way of the sick soul seems unmanly and diseased, end quote. Footnote 569 cites the source. Nor should it be surprising that, quote, in their extreme forms of pure naturalism and pure salvationism, the two types are violently contrasted, end quote. Footnote 570 cites the source. What is surprising, in my opinion, is that James expresses a much more favorable impression of the twice-born type, insofar as he suggests it offers a more penetrating and genuine kind of perspective. The twice-born type is thought to be more genuine in that it acknowledges reality as it really is. According to James, since evil is undeniably real, and the once-born type doesn't fully acknowledge this, as the twice-born type does, the once-born type's minimization of evil constitutes a kind of shortcoming, the cost of which, as Proudfoot points out, quote, is not to take seriously and even to deny an important part of experience, that not everything is good, end quote. Footnote 571 cites the source. In highlighting the disingenuous nature of the once-born type's unbridled optimism and failure to adequately deal with the reality of evil, James claims, quote, it is impossible to carry on this discipline in the subjective sphere without zealously emphasizing the brighter and minimizing the darker aspects of the objective sphere of things at the same time, end quote. Footnote 572 cites the source. By contrast, in acknowledging and dealing with evil, the twice-born type is thought to represent a broader spectrum of human experience. Hence, James ultimately suggests, quote, it seems to me that we are bound to say that morbid-mindedness ranges over the wider scale of experience, and that its survey is the one that overlaps, end quote. Footnote 573 cites the source. Thus, James characterizes once-born religious individuals as being simple-minded, if not dishonest, in this regard, failing to adequately acknowledge or appreciate the stark reality of evil in earthly life. The twice-born, on the other hand, are said to have a greater awareness of the true nature of reality. Ultimately, as Proudfoot suggests, Quote, to James, this position is much more realistic than that of the healthy-minded type. It is not predicated on the denial of evil and thus on self-deception, end quote. Footnote 574 cites the source. Not surprisingly, James offers an explanation of the religious adjustment to the higher unseen power in psychological terms. On his account, a human being is equipped with a mind, which he defines as, quote, a system of ideas, each with the excitement it arouses, and with tendencies impulsive and inhibitive, which mutually check or reinforce one another, end quote. Footnote 575 cites the source. When the ideas and propensities within an individual strongly conflict, internal discord and unhappiness are the result. Consequently, as James says, quote, unhappiness is apt to characterize the period of order-making and struggle, end quote. Footnote 576 cites the source. Those suffering from this kind of discord either continue on in this maladapted way, or they undergo a process James calls unification, which resolves the internal discord by unifying the disparate psychological tendencies responsible for the internal strife. Once tormented by conflicting emotions and drives, an individual spared by unification no longer experiences their wrath. Conversion is the term James uses to describe this process of unification in cases of religious, both once and twice born, experience. James conceptualizes conversion as follows, quote, to be converted, to be regenerated, to receive grace, to experience religion, to gain an assurance, are so many phrases which denote the process, gradual or sudden, by which a self, hitherto divided and consciously wrong, inferior, and unhappy, becomes unified and consciously right, superior, and happy, in consequence of its firmer hold upon religious realities, end quote. Footnote 577 cites the source. Moreover, according to James, quote, to say that a man is converted means, in these terms, that religious ideas, previously peripheral in his consciousness, now take a central place, and that religious aims form the habitual center of his energy, end quote. Footnote 578 cites the source. While conversion comes in many forms, the result is always the same, sanctification. According to James, sanctification signals the newfound sense of ease that replaces the internal discord formerly present within the converted individual. He describes the process of sanctification in the following passage. Quote, what is attained is often an altogether new level of spiritual vitality, a relatively heroic level, in which impossible things have become possible, and new energies and endurances are shown. The personality is changed. The man is born anew, whether or not his psychological idiosyncrasies are what give the particular shape to his metamorphosis. Sanctification is the technical name of this result, end quote. Footnote 579 cites the source. According to James, sanctification yields several significant effects. 1, a sense of higher control. 2, the loss of worry. 3, a sense of enlightenment. 4, a change in attitude toward life. And most notably, 5, an, quote, ecstasy of happiness, end quote. Footnote 580 cites the source. These effects of sanctification will be addressed in more detail in section A of part 3, where I address what James has to say regarding the fruits of saintliness. James also notes that the process of conversion remains a mystery, e.g. why some individuals are converted while others are not. And he observes that, quote, some persons, for instance, never are, and possibly never under any circumstances could be, converted. Religious ideas cannot become the center of their spiritual energy, end quote. Footnote 581 cites the source. What's more, some begin with religion only to abandon it later, although James thinks that this is rare, while others only find religion much later in life. No doubt, as James notes, quote, even late in life, some thaw, end quote. Footnote 582 cites the source. While admittedly uncertain of its roots, James thinks that the subconscious likely plays a significant role in the process of conversion. Indeed, the subconscious is a theme frequently invoked by James throughout Varieties, and he makes it clear that manifestations of religious life, quote, frequently connect themselves with the subconscious part of our existence, end quote. Footnote 583 cites the source. According to James, there are two general methods of conversion, the voluntary type, which is thought to be consciously triggered, and the involuntary type, which is thought to be subconsciously triggered. Footnote 584. These are my terms for the distinction. James doesn't seem to use fixed terms for the two types. However, he does suggest that, quote, we find both ways exemplified in the history of conversion, giving us two types, which Starbucks called the volitional type and the type by self-surrender, respectively, end quote. And he employs these descriptors himself at times. End of footnote 584, and I do quote or cite the source of the quotation within that footnote as well. End of footnote 584. In the case of the voluntary type, a conscious and concerted effort is made to resolve the internal stress, which eventually happens in due time. In the case of the involuntary type, on the other hand, virtually the opposite takes place. Rather than try to fix things, the subject of the conversion surrenders, and the conversion is triggered suddenly by subconscious influences, not by any conscious effort on the part of the subject. James claims that the voluntary type, quote, are as a rule less interesting than those of the self-surrender, i.e. involuntary type, in which case the subconscious effects are more abundant and often startling, end quote. Footnote 585 cites the source. Interestingly, James suggests that self-surrender, which is the trademark of the involuntary type, is actually involved in both types. While the voluntary type consciously strives to reach a resolution, James claims some degree of self-surrender is ultimately needed to, quote, get them over the hump, end quote. Thus he concludes, quote, the difference between the two types is after all not radical. Even in the most voluntarily built up sort of regeneration, there are passages of partial self-surrender interposed. And in the great majority of all cases, it seems that the very last step must be left to other forces and performed without the help of its, i.e., the individual's own will, activity. In other words, self-surrender becomes then indispensable. End quote. Footnote 586 cites the source. The upshot is that, in all instances, conversion ultimately entails the assistance of what the converted believes to be the higher, unseen power. Consequently, quote, you see why self-surrender has been and always must be regarded as the vital turning point of the religious life, end quote. Footnote 587 cites the source. And why, quote, it always seems, after the surrender of the personal will, as if an extraneous higher power had flooded in and taken possession, end quote. Footnote 588 cites the source. In addition to a fundamental belief in the reality of an unseen higher power and an adjustment to this power, James references three additional features commonly associated with religion: sacrifice, confession, and prayer. Footnote 589. Quote, in most books on religion, he observes, three things are represented as its most essential elements. These are sacrifice, confession, and prayer, end quote. And I cite the source in that footnote 589. End of footnote 589. While James believes that sacrifice and confession are indeed common features of religious experience, he suggests that prayer is an essentially vital feature of religious phenomena. According to James, in its, quote, wildest sense, end quote, prayer signals, quote, every kind of inward communion or conversation with the power recognized as divine, end quote. Footnote 590 cites the source. As such, it, quote, is the very soul and essence of religion, end quote. As, quote, the religious phenomenon studied as an inner fact and apart from ecclesiastical or theological complications, has shown itself to consist everywhere and at all its stages in the consciousness with which individuals have an intercourse between themselves and higher powers, with which they feel themselves to be related. End quote. Footnote 591 cites the source. Hence, prayer reflects the religious individual's essential belief in the reality of the unseen and is a manifestation of the individual's reaction or adjustment to it. Now, before proceeding to an examination of what James specifically says regarding the utility of religion, I want to first summarize his more general description of it, which I've outlined in this part of the chapter. I can think of no better way to do this than to quote James himself, who offers his own summary in his final lecture. Religion, he says, involves the following beliefs and psychological characteristics. 1. So, quote, 1. That the visible world is part of a more spiritual universe from which it draws its chief significance. 2. That union or harmonious relation with that higher universe is our true end. 3. That prayer or inner communion with the spirit thereof, be that spirit God or law, is a process wherein work is really done and spiritual energy flows in and produces effects, psychological or material, within the phenomenal world. Religion includes also the following psychological characteristics. 4. A new zest which adds itself like a gift to life and takes the form either of a lyrical enchantment or of appeal to earnestness and heroism. 5. An assurance of safety and a temper of peace, and in relation to others, a preponderance of loving affections. End quote. Footnote 592 cites the source. So again, that was section B of part 2 of chapter 3, William James and the Varieties of Religious Experience, from The Utility of Religion, Nietzsche, and James. Thanks.